Hello there, and welcome to Tabletop Tidbits, the place where we talk about TTRPGs, the community, all manner of things regarding the games we love, and it's going to be a bit more chill, less produced than I'm used to, producing all these videos with editing. Instead, it's going to be time for us to chill out, you can put this on the background, and we can talk about the games that we love. And the topic today that I want to address is one that's a bit more specific, and that is the talk of Ancestry. Or some people might call it species, some people might call it race, it doesn't matter. This isn't going to be about whether the word itself, what it means, and whether it's better to use one or the other. That's not today. The discussion instead is going to be about designing Ancestry and why there are different ancestries to begin with. So, if we take something like Knave, it never specifies whether or not you can play characters of a different kind. All the art depicts, of course, quite cartoonishly looking people, but are they humans? Are they all humans? There's one picture of one guy who's like quite short, looking up, and he has quite like a squashed face and what have you, and looks kind of like maybe goblin or dwarf-like. It's kind of hard to tell, but maybe that's the intention. Is it a game where you can play elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, or is it just humans? And for a fantasy game, it's not abnormal to have a game where you can only play humans. There are other games that do this exact thing. And also, there are lots of other games that aren't fantasy that play with the idea that you are a human. A lot of sci-fi does this. Games that aren't space opera, just like Star Wars and Star Trek. You have stuff like Mothership, which is, a horror game, admittedly, and Alien, which is another horror game, admittedly, but there are a bunch of games that do focus on you playing either humans or human-adjacent like things, maybe androids, which are very similar, or even robots, which are just things created by humans, what have you. So what about the games that do the different thing, the more common associated with fantasy role-playing games, and that is games that allow you to play things that aren't humans? First of all, this is going to be a discussion that goes through a lot of points. What's your thoughts on humans in a game where you can play anything else? This discussion has went through so much discourse online, and it will never be solved, but it is an interesting point to cover anyway. If anyone knows me, they know that I love playing humans, and people always say it is the most boring choice, and funnily enough, despite the fact that I have this opinion that I love playing humans, pretty much everyone around me does not share this opinion, and they think that playing a human is much more boring because I'm already a human. Why would I play myself? Or another more upsetting sentence is, why would I want to be anything like me? I come here to play things that aren't myself for escapism. That's an unfortunate truth for some, but yeah, so I want to play anything but a human, because that's interesting. If I'm playing a fantasy game, I want to involve myself with the fantasy of playing something that isn't me. I'm not a big buff elven barbarian or Goliath barbarian, so I want to play one in this game. And I can be a human at any time, and let me tell you, that I'm a human and they're typically quite boring, but, well, I think humans are great. I think the fact that they have a lot of weaknesses compared to other ancestries that we know of, and when I say weaknesses, I don't mean that, they don't get X, Y, and Z. I mean, for example, if you play something like D&D, the game that's, has a name with dungeon in the title, but despite the fact that that's the case, a lot of the races and species, whatever you want to call them, have dark vision, meaning that they can see in the dark, which means that this torch in the equipment list is useless. And if there's one person in the party with a torch who's constantly giving the game away about there being someone in the dungeon and no one can just stealth through in the dark, then you're going to be the one out. But that's why I like being humans, because I'll have a group with just a bunch of people who can see in the dark, and then me with a torch in one hand in the back, just, I'm in a dungeon, this is terrifying, and I can't see in the dark. I need this aid, which means that there's a weakness. I can't just hold a shield and a sword in one hand, blitz into the darkness and be fine. I have to have a torch in one hand, decrease on my either attack ability or my defense ability because I can't hold a shield. There's that involvement when it comes to humans. And also, we know what humans are like. We are just vessels that like to learn things. We don't have inherent magic in real life. We don't have inherent biological superpowers. That's what things like superheroes and those sort of fantasies that we read in comics and movies, that kind of thing, that's what they're for, to explore these ideas. And playing a human gives you this sort of empty vessel. Again, you're not a dwarf that can be sturdy and see in the dark. You're not an elf, which can be light-footed and graceful and also see in the dark. You are this human. All of your plainness, in a way, your lack of your innate ability to resist fire, your innate ability to shrug off damage, your innate ability to see in the dark or be lucky, none of that is in there. So what is left is someone who can be adaptive to the world around them. And that's why I love humans, because they seem so out of place. And I love the fact that you can have places where it's a fantasy world, but despite that, there's a lot more humans than there are other beings, because I guess we horny, or we just have children at this age, so therefore there's a lot of humans. But with there being a lot of humans, it means that everyone around us can also be a predominant chance that everyone's going to be human in an NPC scenario, meaning that those people who are playing stuff like elves and dwarves can be standouts, and you're probably going to have an adventuring party full of people without humans, and that's just apparently what adventuring parties are now. There are going to be people that say, I love playing humans, what are you talking about? But in most situations I've GM'd, no one has played a human. I think once someone did. Someone even pretended to be human, but they weren't. So, so playing a human is this interesting idea in a fantasy world, because it's just a plain normal guy, just experiencing all the horrors that other people can experience with their innate powers that they get from just being fey-touched or part of the stone world. So if you're a human, the fantasy is just, I'm a human, out of my depth, in a magical place. Maybe I'm a human with magic, but what about the other peoples? We have dwarves and elves and different fantasy races. We have things like Starfinder, which has the different aliens. Now here's the question. Why do we care? Why do we care about being something that isn't a human? Like, yeah, we've got the fantasy of being a different person. But isn't it interesting that we've now started to move towards the idea that regardless of what you are playing, a lot of people typically play them like humans. I've had comments in the past that have said, well, of course that's the case. You are a human. How are you supposed to just, you expect everyone to have an alien-minded, know how an elf thinks or a dwarf thinks in every single scenario? I guess that would be, it would be hard to assume that everyone could do that. So I appreciate that sentiment, but at the same time, a lot of the design, the sort of the words as things have been written in the new books and stuff for D&D, or the opinions online, is that actually is it limiting? Is it limiting to have this idea that elves act in this way, or dwarves act in this way? And if you think that, well, no, anyone can play anything, it's all just free and easy here. If that's the case, why not play a human? Or is it for the abilities that you want it? So you could play anything. If a human was granted elf-like abilities, but they were a human, would you play a human? Well, no, I want to play something different other than me. But you play one like me, like a person. So the question, of course, comes back to the fantasy, the design of these things. So if you have an ancestry, like a human or a dwarf or elf, why are you playing them? Why are you playing a more mystical race, species, or ancestry? If you're playing something like a dwarf, you want to be the big burly boy, but then does that not stand antithetical to the idea that I can play anything? So isn't it stereotypical for dwarves to be like this? And this is this constant barrage of arguments of we want to be free to play whatever we want. However, we don't want to be limited to these. But we do like embracing the stereotypes of these other things. I like alcohol and being stoic and stubborn, but I don't want to be limited and grouped together as all dwarves need to be like that. And then you ask the question of, okay, so if we want them all to be the same, then let them all be the same. Let's all play humans. Oh no, I want to play something different. This constant argument in our heads of what people want to play and what they invoke as a fantasy. So that comes back again. So what is the fantasy of playing an elf? Okay, I'm more pretty. I'm fair-like. I can move and glide through the trees. I'm more graceful. But what if you play an elven barbarian and you play them just a rough and tumble, thick accented and loud? Is that not antithetical to the fantasy? What is the fantasy of playing something that isn't a human? Well, now this comes back to the question of, well, these two things can't exist together perfectly, can they? Because you have some groups that are going to be like, you're an elf, that means you act like X, Y, and Z. You're a dwarf, that means you're stubborn and you act like X, Y, and Z. Other groups are going to be like, no, but I want to be free and easy, I want to play anything. And the only difference between you and I is the abilities that we have. So, when you are designing Ancestries, of course, you have to consider, first of all, do they even have abilities? Do I get an ability from being what I am? Because if they do, that means that there is a biological difference between them. And if not, then there is no difference between them. And what is the fantasy then? If there's no mechanical fantasy to being a dwarf, and there's no mechanical fantasy with being an elf, then what is the fantasy? I'm an elf? Okay, but what if you play them just like a human? Then there's no mechanical, and there's no cultural or the way you act sort of fantasy. So what's left? Why do we care so much about being these different ancestries? If we want to play what we want, how we want, well, of course, there are some people that do adhere to the idea that as a dwarf, I come from this culture, and as a result, I act like this. But what if you didn't grow up in that culture? What if this ancestry didn't grow up amongst other dwarves? What if it was a adopted child? What if it was like a dwarf who grew up with humans, elves, and they didn't mind what it was? That he was just a child, an innocent person that they could grow up with them, and they taught them all the things that they know. And as a result, you have a dwarf who acts very fair-like. They know they're not an elf. They're incredibly, like, they're much shorter than all the other elves in their tribe, but they don't care because it's part of their family. And as a result, culturally, they're completely different. So then, if this character doesn't have to adhere to a personality that is apparently innate, which if we have the idea that they're not innately personality-wise, for stereotypical and biological and also culturally, and starting to delve into things like schisms and racisms, that kind of thing, if we don't want to avoid that, then what is left? If we don't have the culture, the personality, or the mechanics, then what's left? So I guess we're going to have to rely on the mechanics. So dwarves can see in the dark. Elves can see in the dark for some reason. This has always been a sticking point for me. Why do elves see in the dark? They're forest-dwelling boys. They're not nocturnal, are they? Because they can trance. They can meditate and trance, and as a result, I get up sometimes in the dark hours, meaning I can see in the dark. It makes sense for a drow, in my mind, for the people who live in the Underdark to be able to see in the dark, but that's why in Sanctum, any of the games that I have, what I call glades, or, half-elf, if you want to call them like that, but don't call them half-elf. Apparently that's inherently racist, as the developers of D&D have once said about the new books. Look it up. That's not me just exaggerating that. That is exactly how it was put. I love that. So yeah, when I make glades, or half-elves, what have you, they don't have any form of gloom sight. They can't see in the dark because, it's an elf. That's getting off topic though. So, when you're designing Ancestry, what do you want to create? What fantasies are you trying to create? Well, okay, let's consider all we've said and just steam on ahead anyway. Ignore all what we've just said about, will it even matter? Let's say it does. Let's say it matters to some people, and we're going to put it in there so people can latch on to what you've put in. You can put things about the culture, how they typically act, and the mechanics, and people can just ignore all the culture, pick what, like a dwarf because they've seen Lord of the Rings, and think that's what a dwarf is, despite what you've written, because I can play what we like. So, what's left? The mechanics. Well, as I've asked people, or at least I've seen it being discussed on forums and Reddit pages, that kind of thing, before, when it comes to things like the fantasy of what each race or ancestry or species has, is that some of them are typically allotted a more weaker bag. For example, humans. What are they here for? They get a feat sometimes if it's D&D. Otherwise, they get a skill. They're better at this because apparently they paid attention in school, but no one else did. It's weird. It's the only thing we can allot humans because they can't innately do anything special because they're humans. Unless you play around with the setting. For example, the Draw Steel just bang my table. The Draw Steel RPG, for example, they have humans as their innate ability is that they're almost like empty vessels that are connected to this world, and as a result, they can sense magic. They're not like other humans where they don't have an ability, they have an innate ability to sense magic around them. And that is just a part of Matt's design and Matt's setting. That's how humans kind of work. So, there's that. You don't have to conform to the notions that, yes, humans have nothing and elves can see in the dark. You definitely don't have to conform to that one. You have my permission. But then, what about other games? I'm thinking of the likes of Daggerheart, which recently came out. You know, you have something like the Felines. I think that's what they're called. I can't remember. You have the Ribbits. You play as little frog peoples, and they have the innate ability, because they are frog peoples, to reel people in, I think. That might have been an earlier version. I haven't checked the newer version. You have Furbolgs. You have humans, dwarves, as we're used to. You have giants you can play as one, because it's not a tactical game. You can play as a giant and not have to worry about like how specifically big you are, that kind of thing. So when you have games like that and they have their own little cards and their abilities, what do you put in? What fits the design of this ancestry? Some people have went with the idea that if you have something like a cat person, they get claws, which becomes inherently useless if you play a wizard or something that can cast spells, someone who uses range. I have claws that do the least amount of damage in my arsenal because it's my claws versus my like super spells or super arrow shots. So I'm left with this a useless ability that is innately part of my like roster because of what I am. I'm a cat person, therefore I have claws, right? Or I can climb. Cool. That guy can just resist being on fire. That guy can cast spells because he's a devil boy. So what fits the fantasy and what will invoke the idea of specifically what I think you should focus on your setting. Unless you want to create just another clone of what we have already, what matters to you about these ancestries? What is it about playing a dwarf that you love, that you think is really good? Well, for example, in my setting, I love the idea that dwarves, as a setting reason, their culture normally involves the fact that they love stories. They love legends, and the medium that they tell them through is their appearance and their homes. If you walk into a dwarven home, it will be full of just what looks like random tat, but you then ask them, why is there like a cup, just a random dirty cup there? And they go, well, let me tell you, sit down, it's going to be like a good 2-hour story. That kind of thing. Or some dwarves, well, a lot of the dwarves have something about their beards or their person, like their whole person, which displays a theme. For example, I've written in as some of the examples that some of them have what looks to be like a bunch of hair. Like, obviously it's a beard, but like their main beard is brown or ginger, whatever, yeah? But then they've got patches of white and grey and blonde. Why is that? Well, that particular clan or family of dwarves, you might decide that when they die, when their ancestors die, they take the beard and they put it in. So as the generations go on, you'll have a really old dwarf with just an absolute massive patchwork quilt of a beard. Then there's another one where on back of that one, you might decide in fact that they don't take it from their ancestors. When they kill another dwarf as a mark of disrespect, they shave them and then take their corpses like beard and put it in their own to show that they are some sort of mighty dwarf killer, which it sounds quite profane. I love it. Another one that I made was the idea that dwarves inherently, because of their whole telling stories, they also look to their past, their ancestors. You might think that's quite core to a dwarf. I do, but I like to exacerbate it even more. They're incredibly passionate. They love food, they love drink, they love stories, they love shouting, they love songs. They are beings of passion, not just beings of stone and mining and hi-ho, that kind of stuff. They're not that. They're not diggy hole. Thanks, Yogscast, by the way. They are beings of passion. That's how I've always felt about dwarves. They are humans that are being cracked down to 4 foot tall, and in that density, they are much more passionate and stoic and stubborn. And as a result, when they are joyful, they really let it out. You might have those that look towards the ancestry, and they are painted red. Like they've got a side of their face painted red to sort of atone for an ancestor's sin in the past. One of them is much more funny in that some of the dwarves wear a bunch of feathers everywhere, and it's like, oh, are they they people that like hawks? They're like aviary people? No. One of their ancestors was crazy, and he covered himself in tar, ran about the streets constantly, covering himself in feathers, so he looked like a chicken. And as a result, from this old crazy ancestor that everyone sort of smiled and loved, but also because it was the olden days. They definitely should have stepped in and tried to help this man. But as a result of that, all of their ancestors, their descendants, they love to honour this previous very fun and very like wacky story of their ancestor that was a bit kooky, I was going to say cocky, but no, a bit kooky cock. So the fantasy of what you want to create with your setting is the focus. Disregard what people will pick up your book and say like, oh no, this isn't what a dwarf is. What's a dwarf to you? Do you think humans should inherently have some magical ability? Are humans the perfect vessel for the compare? Are they perfect because they used to be a human farmer who picked up a sword and now they're a human fighter and they have no magical inherent weird interest, and now that you're on adventurers and you have all these weird people around them, all these weird things that you see, you are the perfect sort of vessel to see what the fantasy world is like compared to your normalcy. Do you like that? Or do you like giving humans something odd, something weird? Do you think elves shouldn't be able to see in the dark? Do you think that dwarves aren't inherently beings of the world? Do you think they are? I know that the likes of, is it Symbaroum? I'll have to check it up. But there's a setting that I love, and a part of it, the dwarves are inherently like elementals almost. They are beings of the world. It is said that they are supposed to carry on this lineage, the idea that dwarves are supposed to be almost like a labour class of ancestry made by ancient god beings that were supposed to make them build the world. That's the purpose of dwarves in an inherent years and years go back sort of idea, that dwarves are like beings of stone. And I've seen other designs of dwarves that give them like a third eye, and they are mystical beings. They're not these ideas of like, you know, the Lord of the Rings, drink and smoke and shout sort of dwarf. Instead, they are inherently mystical. They aren't the norm, and you can go away from the norm. You don't have to be like, right, this cat person, as a result, has claws and they're going to feel useless. You can be like, okay, it's a cat. They are inherently connected to what we think about cats in our world, as in the spirituality of cats. How the Egyptians love to have cats. They have the association, of how cats have this link to the spirit world. Go with that. If you think that's quite interesting, go with that. You don't have to go with, oh, he's a cat, therefore they have murder beans and they can climb and they knock stuff over and they like trinkets. Go in whatever direction you want. And that is the sort of fantasy that you want to create. The fantasy that you love, you are passionate about, and you hope other people will also share in that same want to engage in the fantasy that you've brought them. Don't try and fit to the mold that everyone wants. Try and go for what you would really like, because, as I've said before, you might pick up this book that you've made and go, oh, hello, there's Ancestry does something quite interesting. Isn't that cool? And they start spreading the word, like I've just done. Oh, look, these dwarves aren't inherently just alcohol-loving short boys. They are mystical beings that, like, tread with illusions and magic. Isn't that fun? I want to play a dwarf in this setting. Isn't that cool? That is the result of you chasing your passion and going for a fantasy and focusing on what you want to bring people to allow them to play. That is what you should be going for, not trying to fit the mold of what makes sense, because there is no sense. All this fantasy that we have in like D&D, Pathfinder, different games that we play, it's all a result of people taking a riff on real life folklore. Go back to folklore. Consider where the origins of all these ancestries. What do people want? Maybe some people want the very traditional idea of what a gnome is. Maybe they are incredibly small. Go with that. Who knows? It's up to you, and you should not be restricted, and you should also not be told that your choices to play a human or different ancestries are inherently boring or inherently interesting because they are more wacky and weird and they have horns on their head. If you want to play the game so that this boring ancestry is genuinely really interesting because you play them more interesting, then that is down to you and not what's in the book. Not down to the mechanics, because they can only give you something you can actually do in the game and not who this character is. So, when it comes to Ancestry, what do you want to give people? What do you want to give the players of your game? What do you want to engage with? What do you think people would enjoy? When it comes to playtesting, and they start to say, I like this and don't like this, what are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of what people actually like? These are all considerations when it comes to the fantasy of Ancestries because it's hard to pin down. Some people want this, some people don't, and some people really can't agree with what they want. Are elves inherently mystical, or are they just like humans with the ability to traverse the wilds better and have a bit more movement speed? These are all different groups, different players, and different perspectives. So you can't please them all. Create what you want. Create the best version of your setting and the ancestries you want to give people. And that's the best you can do. People are going to argue about what the best fantasy is or what the fantasy is of playing this kind of thing is, but at the end of the day, you hold the pen. So when you're designing, it's down to you. And I'll leave you with that. Consider the fantasy in all things what you want to give your players of your game to invoke and to have fun with, and it's down to you as the creator to give it to them. So, with that being said, I love you all, have fun designing, and I'll see you next time.